Margaret had grown used to the silence in her small Vermont cottage. The days all looked the same: gentle mornings of tea and crossword puzzles, long afternoons with the steady tick of the wall clock, evenings watching the golden light fade across the hills. At 73, she thought she had already lived through all the surprises life could throw at her. But that crisp October afternoon, as the leaves scattered across her porch, a knock at the door broke the stillness. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her neighbors rarely visited unannounced, and her son lived on the other side of the country. She hesitated, heart thumping, before opening the door. Standing there was a young man, tall, with dark hair falling just slightly into his eyes, and a small suitcase at his side. For a long second, Margaret couldn't breathe. The boyish smile, the way his gaze softened, there was something achingly familiar about him. "Grandma," he said, voice low but clear. "It's me, Daniel." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. She hadn't heard that name spoken in her home for years. Her grandson. The child she had last seen when he was no more than 8 years old, chasing fireflies in her garden one summer long ago. Life had pulled him away. His parents had moved far, and then the visits slowed. The phone calls turned shorter, and eventually silence had settled like a heavy curtain. And now, out of nowhere, he was on her porch as though no years had passed at all. Tears filled her eyes before she even realized. "Daniel?" she whispered. He nodded, his smile nervous but hopeful. "I know it's sudden. I should have called, but I didn't know if you'd want to see me." Margaret's hand went to her chest, her heart pounding hard. "Want to see you?" "My dear boy," her voice broke, and she reached out, pulling him into her arms. The scent of autumn clung to him, the faint smell of train stations and long roads traveled. He hugged her back, strong and steady, and for a moment, Margaret felt the years melt away. When she pulled back, she studied his face. He was no longer the boy she remembered. The round cheeks were gone, replaced by sharp lines of adulthood. His eyes, though the same deep hazel as her late husband's, seemed older than his years, carrying shadows she didn't yet understand. "Come in," she said quickly, stepping aside. "You must be cold and hungry." Daniel carried his suitcase inside, his eyes roaming over the cottage as though he were walking into a memory. The old grandfather clock still stood in the corner, ticking softly. The photographs on the mantelpiece still showed family faces, though faded with time. He lingered for a second by a picture of Margaret's late husband in his uniform, and his expression softened. "You haven't changed much, Grandma," he said, setting down his bag. Margaret gave a small laugh, wiping at her eyes. "Flattery. Look at me. I'm older, slower. But you're all grown up." They sat in the kitchen where Margaret poured him tea. The kettle whistled like it had done every day, but this time the sound felt alive, full of purpose. She placed a plate of cookies between them, her hands trembling just slightly. Daniel sipped carefully before speaking. "I'm sorry for showing up like this. I didn't know how else to do it." Margaret tilted her head. "Do what, darling?" He hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "I needed to see you, and I needed to tell you something." The words hung heavy in the air. Margaret's heart skipped. Something in his tone carried weight, as though the suitcase he brought wasn't only filled with clothes, but with truths too heavy for him to carry alone. Before she could ask, Daniel's gaze lifted to hers. His eyes, so much like her husband's, were filled with both fear and longing. "I don't know if you're ready to hear it," he said softly. Margaret leaned forward, her voice steady but gentle. "Daniel, whatever it is, you're not alone. You've never been alone. Tell me." He swallowed, glanced down, and then back at her. "I found something, Grandma. After Mom passed away this spring, I found a letter, and it mentioned you. Something about you. Something I don't fully understand yet." Margaret felt the air shift, as though the walls themselves were listening. Her daughter, Emma, gone now, taken too soon, had never been close to her. The distance between them had always been sharp, a quiet wall she had never been able to climb. And now Daniel had brought her something from that silence, something hidden. Her teacup rattled slightly against the saucer. What kind of letter? Daniel looked at her, and in his eyes was the storm of youth, hope, fear, determination. It said you once had a love. Before Grandpa? Margaret's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move. Her mind reeled back decades, to a face she had buried deep in her memory, to the sound of laughter under summer skies, to the letters that had once filled her life with promise. She had never spoken of it, not even to her son, not even to her husband. It had been her secret, her shadow, her ache. And now, here was her grandson standing in her kitchen, speaking the words she thought she'd never hear again. She tried to steady herself, but her voice trembled. Who told you this? Daniel shook his head. I don't know everything. Just what the letter said. That there was someone you loved before. That it mattered. That maybe it still does. Silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace and the faint ticking of the clock. Margaret looked at him, really looked, and realized something. This wasn't just a visit. This wasn't just chance. Daniel hadn't come only for comfort or for memories. He had come carrying the truth she had locked away for a lifetime, her hands folded together tightly, as though holding back the flood of emotions rising inside her. Daniel, she said at last, her voice low, trembling between fear and tenderness. There are things I never thought I would speak of again. But perhaps it's time. And in that moment, with her grandson's steady eyes on hers, Margaret felt the weight of her past press against the present, demanding to be heard. The quiet life she had settled into was no longer quiet at all. Something had been awakened, and nothing would ever be the same again. The night air settled heavy around the cottage. But inside, the rooms glowed with warmth. Margaret moved about the kitchen, setting the table with a kind of nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. She ladled soup into bowls, arranged bread on a plate, and tried to quiet the storm of questions swirling in her mind. Her grandson sat across from her, his posture tense, his eyes carrying secrets too big for someone so young. They ate in near silence at first, the only sound the soft clink of spoons against china. Margaret kept stealing glances at him, studying the way his jaw tightened, the way he avoided her eyes when she pressed too close to the subject. Finally, she set her spoon down and spoke gently. Daniel, you said there was a letter about me. I need to know. Daniel looked up, hesitated, then leaned forward. His voice dropped as though he feared the walls might listen. After Mom passed, I had to go through her things. There were boxes in the attic I'd never seen before. Most were old receipts, photos, random stuff. But then I found an envelope with your name written on it. Margaret's chest tightened. My name, yes, Daniel said, his brow furrowed. But it wasn't from you. It was to you. And it wasn't opened. It was hidden in the bottom of the box. Margaret felt her stomach twist. Who wrote it? Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. A man named William. The name hit her like a sudden wind, knocking the breath from her chest. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. The world seemed to tilt, the present colliding with the past in a rush she wasn't ready for. William, the name she hadn't spoken in decades. The name she had once whispered under starlit skies. Daniel leaned back, watching her carefully. You knew him, didn't you? Margaret closed her eyes, pain and longing washing through her like a tide. Yes, I knew him. More than anyone. More than I should admit. Daniel's expression softened. Then it's true. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. She had thought the past was buried forever. But here it was uncovered by the boy she had once held as a child. Daniel broke the silence. Grandma, there were more letters. Dozens of them. All from him. They were never delivered to you. Mom kept them. The words cut deeper than she expected. Her daughter-in-law had never been close, always polite but distant, always guarding something. Margaret had accepted it as personality. But now she saw it differently. A choice. A deliberate act of silence. Her voice shook. She kept them from me. All those years. Daniel nodded. I don't know why. I don't know if she thought she was protecting Dad or protecting you, but the truth is, she never told anyone. Not even me. I only found them by accident." Margaret stood slowly and walked to the window. The night outside was dark, the trees swaying in the cool wind. She pressed a hand to the glass, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. She remembered William's face, his laugh, the way he had once promised her a life filled with dreams. And then the sharp memory of losing him, choices made by family, obligations she couldn't escape, and a silence that followed her for decades. Behind her, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer now. "I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they weren't meant for you. But when I opened one, the first line had your name. He wrote about you like he still loved you, even years later. I didn't know what to do with them. I thought you deserved to see them." Margaret turned, her face pale. "You read them?" Daniel looked ashamed. "Only a few. I didn't mean to pry, but I couldn't ignore what I found. It felt important, like it wasn't just history, like it still matters." Margaret's heart raced. It did still matter. She had buried the memories, convinced herself that what was lost was gone forever. But the thought of letters, words meant for her, words never received it, lit something inside her she hadn't felt in years. She walked back to the table and sat down, her voice unsteady. "Do you have them with you?" Daniel hesitated. "I brought some, not all. I thought it might be too much all at once. But yes, I brought them." Margaret exhaled, relief and dread tangled together. Her hands shook as she clasped them on the table. She wasn't sure if she had the strength to face the past. But she knew she couldn't turn away now. For a moment, they sat in silence again. The fire popped in the hearth, the clock ticked on the wall, and outside the wind carried the sound of falling leaves. Then Margaret asked the question she feared most. "Daniel, why are you really here? Why now?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with something raw. "Because I think you deserve the truth. And because I didn't want you to be alone when you found out." Margaret's throat tightened. He had grown into a man, but in that moment, she saw the boy she had once rocked to sleep, the child who had once reached for her hand in the garden. He wasn't just delivering her past back to her, he was standing beside her in it. She reached out across the table, laying her wrinkled hand over his. "You don't know what this means to me," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe not, but I know it's important. And I know it's not over." Margaret blinked back tears. Not over. The phrase echoed in her mind like a distant bell. Could it be? After all these years, could something as fragile as hope still survive? Daniel leaned back, his expression cautious but kind. "Grandma, tomorrow I'll show you the letters. Tonight, maybe just rest. You've carried enough already." Margaret nodded, though her mind was far from rest. She rose, moving to the mantel where her husband's photos stood. She touched the frame lightly, her heart aching. She had loved him, in her way. But the truth was more complicated than she had ever let herself admit. And now, with her grandson under her roof and the letters waiting in his suitcase, the life she thought was settled had begun to unravel. She turned back to Daniel, her voice quiet but steady. "Tomorrow, then? But tonight? Stay close. I don't want this house to feel empty again." He smiled softly, nodding. "I'm here, Grandma. I'm not going anywhere." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Margaret knew sleep would not come easily. Memories stirred like restless birds, and with them came questions she had avoided for decades. What had William written? Why had fate stolen those words from her? And, most of all, what was she meant to do with them now? The night deepened around the cottage, the fire burned low, and the unanswered questions pressed heavy in the air. Somewhere in the shadows of memory, William's voice seemed to call her name. And she knew that by morning, the past she had buried would demand to be faced. Morning light crept slowly into the cottage, painting the walls in soft gold. Margaret hadn't slept. She had tossed and turned all night, hearing William's name echo in her thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face as it had been when they were young, bright, hopeful, full of love. Now, decades later, those memories felt both like a comfort and a wound. When she finally came downstairs, Daniel was already waiting at the kitchen table. He had a bundle in front of him, tied with a faded ribbon. His eyes lifted to hers, steady but cautious. "I brought them down," he said quietly. Margaret froze at the sight of the bundle. The letters, real, tangible, words meant for her, hidden from her for so long. Her fingers trembled as she reached out but stopped just before touching them. She almost didn't trust herself. Daniel slid the bundle closer. "They're yours, Grandma. They always were." She nodded, sinking slowly into the chair. For a long moment, she just stared at them. The paper was yellowed, the ribbon frayed. Her name was written in William's handwriting, so familiar, even after all these years. Her breath hitched, and she finally untied the ribbon with careful hands. The first envelope slid free. Her heart raced as she broke the seal. The paper crackled faintly as she unfolded it. She began to read. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of you. I don't know why you haven't answered, but I cannot stop writing. I cannot stop hoping. I promised you once that no matter what came, I would love you. I meant it. Always." Margaret's hand covered her mouth. Tears blurred the words, but she forced herself to keep reading. William had written of his days in the city, of his dreams of returning to her, the way he had carried her memory like a lantern through dark times. Every line was filled with longing. Every sentence carried the weight of a man who refused to let love die. When she finished, she set the letter down gently, as though it might break. Her chest ached, her heart swelling and shattering all at once. Daniel watched her carefully. "So it's true. He loved you." Margaret nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, he did. And I loved him. More than I've ever admitted to anyone." Her voice cracked on the last word. She felt stripped bare, as though the years of silence had been ripped open. She reached for another letter, unable to stop herself. This one was written months later. "I don't understand why your silence continues, but I will not give up. I still believe in us. I still believe in the promise we made. Please, Margaret, don't let the world take this away from us." Her hand shook. The silence William wrote about it hadn't been hers. She had never received these. He must have believed she had chosen to ignore him, to forget him, when in truth she had been waiting for him all along. Daniel spoke gently. "He thought you didn't answer him." Margaret's voice was heavy with grief. "All those years. He must have thought I abandoned him." She pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closing as memories swept her back. She remembered their last dance before he left. The way he had held her, as though the world could collapse and it wouldn't matter. She remembered his promise that no matter how far he went, he would return to her. She had waited at first with hope, then with doubt, then with despair. And when her family pushed her toward another man, when duty demanded she let go, she had buried that love like a secret grave. But now, reading William's words, she realized she hadn't lost him by chance. She had lost him because someone had chosen to steal his voice from her. She whispered to herself, "He never stopped writing. He never stopped loving me." Daniel leaned closer. "And maybe he never stopped waiting for you." Margaret looked at him, stunned. "What do you mean?" Daniel hesitated, then said, the last letter in the stack. It wasn't decades old. It was recent. He was still writing, "Grandma." Even after all those years, her heart nearly stopped. "Recent," Daniel nodded, pulling out a thinner, newer envelope. The paper was less yellowed, the ink sharper. He placed it gently in front of her. "This one's dated just 2 years ago." Margaret's hand hovered over it, shaking. She opened it carefully, afraid the words inside might undo her completely. "Margaret, if this ever reaches you, know that my love never faded. I am an old man now, but in my heart I am still the boy who promised you forever. If you have forgotten me, I understand. But if you have not, then perhaps it isn't too late. I still dream of seeing you once more before my days are done." Margaret broke into sobs, the letter trembling in her hands. William was alive. 2 years ago, he had still been alive, still writing, still waiting. Her daughter-in-law had not only hidden the past, she had hidden the present. Daniel reached across the table and held her hand. "Grandma, he wanted you to know. He wanted you to have this chance." Margaret's tears fell freely. She felt decades of grief and love colliding, leaving her raw and shaken. She looked at Daniel, her voice a whisper. "I thought it was over. I thought it was gone. But all this time, he was still there." Daniel squeezed her hand. "Then maybe it's not too late." Margaret stared at the letters spread across the table, each one a piece of the life she had lost. For so long she had believed love had slipped away, leaving her only with memories. But here was proof that love had endured. Hidden but alive. She gathered the letters close, as though pulling William himself into her arms. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Her heart torn between joy and sorrow. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "I need to find him. I need to know if he's still out there." Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Then we'll find him together." The cottage felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. The past was no longer a shadow, it was a flame burning bright in Margaret's hands. For the first time in decades, she felt young again. Not in body, but in heart. As the fire crackled and the letters lay open before her, Margaret realized something she had buried for too long. Love does not vanish with time. It waits. It survives. It writes letters that never stop. And now. With her grandson beside her and the truth finally in her hands, Margaret knew the story of her life was not finished. Not yet. The morning after Margaret read William's letters, she felt a restlessness she hadn't known in years. For so long, her days had followed the same quiet rhythm, but now every moment seemed alive with urgency. She moved through the kitchen, her hands trembling as she poured tea. Her mind racing with only one thought: finding him. Daniel sat across from her, watching her carefully. He could see the fire in her eyes, the determination of someone who had been given back a piece of her soul. "Grandma," he said gently, "if you want to look for him, I'll help you. You don't have to do this alone." Margaret looked at him, her lips pressed together in a trembling line. "I'm afraid, Daniel. What if it's too late? What if he's gone?" Daniel leaned forward. "And what if he isn't? What if he's still waiting, just like the letter said?" Her eyes filled with tears. For decades, she had lived as though the chapter of her life with William had ended, sealed away like a closed book. But now the book was open again, and she couldn't bear the thought of not turning the next page. She rose from her chair and walked to the mantel, where William's letters were stacked neatly. She touched the top one with gentle fingers. "If he's out there," she whispered, "I have to see him. I can't let this chance pass again." Daniel stood, his voice steady. "Then we'll find him." The day unfolded in a blur. Daniel pulled out his laptop, and together they began searching. They typed in William's full name, scanning records, addresses, and old news clippings. Margaret's heart pounded with every lead, every possibility. Some results were dead ends, others too far away. But she clung to hope, her pulse racing like it hadn't in years. At one point, Daniel looked up with a spark in his eyes. "Grandma, I think I found something." Margaret hurried to his side. On the screen was a directory listing a retirement home in Massachusetts, not far from where William had once lived. The name matched. The age matched. Her breath caught. "It could be him," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "It's close enough to try." For a moment, Margaret froze. The reality of it all pressed down on her. If it was him, what would she say? Would he even remember her? Would he forgive her for the silence she hadn't chosen? Her knees felt weak, but Daniel's hand on her shoulder grounded her. "Grandma," he said softly, "you've carried this love your whole life. Don't let fear take it from you now." Her chest rose and fell with a shaky breath. "You're right. I can't stay silent anymore." That afternoon, they packed a small bag. Margaret tucked the letters inside, her hands trembling as though she were carrying her own heart. Daniel drove, the autumn roads winding beneath trees painted in shades of fire and gold. The scenery blurred past, but Margaret barely noticed. Her mind was filled with memories. William's laugh. It's the way he used to hold her hand, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. At one point, Daniel glanced at her. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret gave a small, wistful smile. "I'm thinking about the girl I once was. The girl who believed love could survive anything." Maybe she was right. When they finally pulled into the quiet drive of the retirement home, Margaret's hands gripped tightly around her bag. The building stood modest but warm, its windows glowing with late afternoon light. She felt her heart pound against her ribs as if she were a young woman again. Standing on the edge of something life-changing, inside the staff welcomed them kindly. Daniel spoke to the receptionist while Margaret lingered nearby. Clutching the letters like a lifeline, "We're looking for a resident named William Harris," Daniel said gently. The receptionist scanned the records, then nodded. "Yes, he's here. Would you like me to let him know you've come?" Margaret's knees nearly gave out. Daniel steadied her, whispering, "It's him. He's alive." Her chest tightened, tears stinging her eyes. After all these years, after all the silence, William was still here. Still within reach. Moments later, a staff member guided them down a quiet hallway. Margaret's breath came shallow, her pulse racing with every step. At the end of the hall was a sunlit room, the door slightly open. The staff member knocked softly before stepping aside. "Mr. Harris," she said, "you have visitors." Margaret stood frozen in the doorway. Inside, an elderly man sat by the window, a book resting in his hands. His hair was white, his frame thinner. But when he lifted his head, his eyes were the same clear, deep. And familiar. The world fell away. "William," she whispered, her voice breaking. The book slipped from his hands. His eyes widened, and for a moment he simply stared, as though afraid she was a dream. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. His voice trembled as he spoke her name. "Margaret?" Tears blurred her vision. She nodded, stepping inside, clutching the letters to her chest. "Yes, it's me. It's really me." He took a step forward, his hands trembling, his breath catching. Decades of longing, pain, and hope filled the space between them. When he finally reached her, his hand lifted hesitantly. As though asking permission to touch her, Margaret placed her hand in his, and the years melted away. The room seemed to glow, the air thick with unspoken words, lost time, and love that had never truly left. Neither spoke for a long moment. Their eyes said everything. Finally, William's voice broke the silence. "I thought you forgot me. I thought you chose another life." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. She lifted the bundle of letters. "I never got them, William. I never knew. They were hidden from me. But I never stopped loving you." His face crumpled with emotion, and he pulled her into his arms. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt whole. The years apart, the silence, a kit, all dissolved in that embrace. Daniel stood quietly in the doorway, watching the reunion with a tender smile. He knew he had done what he came for. He had brought them back together. Margaret pulled back just enough to look into William's eyes. "We don't have forever," she whispered, "but we have today, and maybe tomorrow, and that's enough." William cupped her face gently, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "It's more than I ever dreamed," as the sun dipped low outside the window, casting golden light across the room. Margaret realized that love had never truly left her. It had waited patiently, hidden but alive, till the day her grandson knocked on her door and handed her back the life she thought she had lost. And in that moment, she knew, some stories don't end with time. Some stories wait for their final chapter, no matter how many years have passed.